Also, let's go to Matthew chapter 22. I just want to set a few things in place so that we can better understand the teaching. Matthew chapter 22. Let's take it from verse 34. Right, it says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus that is, with this question. He says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? This guy was asking Jesus, out of all the laws of Moses, all the do's and don'ts, when God says don't have any other God, and don't steal, and don't kill, and don't covet, and this, that, and the other, he says, out of all those commandments that God has given us, and this is very, very, very key, because not a lot of people teach on this point, but this guy was asking Jesus, what's the most important thing? In essence, it's saying, what's the most important thing? If you were to sum it up in one word, what would you say is the most important topic in the whole of the Bible? Out of every commandment, out of every instruction that God has given us, which one would you say is the most important, number one, priority out of all of them? He says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And listen to what Jesus says in verse 37. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's the greatest commandment. Jesus said, out of everything, that's the most important one. And then he goes on to say in verse 39, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then in verse 40 he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. In other words, the whole of the Old Testament. Because the law and the prophets refer to the laws of Moses, and the laws refers to the laws of Moses, your Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and the prophets was referring to all the other books, your Daniels, your Ezekiel's, Jeremiah's, Isaiah's. The whole of the Old Testament, basically, Jesus said, the whole of the Old Testament can be summed up with those two sentences, or those two commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. He's saying that that's, in the Christian walk, in Christianity, he's saying that that's the most important thing. That nothing else is as important as this. That if you do this, everything else is covered. If you do this, you don't have to worry about nothing else. Because this is what it's all about. In essence, that's what he's saying. And last week I was saying that, okay, we know who God is. It says we should love God with all our heart, our soul, and mind, right? We know who God is. We might not know him completely or as much as we would like to know him, but we know that God is creator of heaven, we know we should worship him and all that kind of stuff. But then he also said that we should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So who's our neighbor? And that's another question we asked last week. That who is our neighbor that Jesus is talking about? Is he talking about my next door neighbor? Do I love my next door neighbor and hate everybody else? Who is my neighbor? And Jesus also gave us the answer to that question. And we found that in Matthew, was it Luke 10? Let me see if I can find it. I think it's in Luke actually. I'm trying to do a quick recap. I'm sure it's Luke 10. Yes, Luke 10 from let's take it from verse 25. And it's I think it's a similar story, probably the same story that we just read in Matthew, but this time it's Luke. Luke was another one of Jesus' disciples, and Luke is given his angle on what he saw that day. And the interesting thing about life is that we can all see the same thing, but when it's time for us to talk about what we saw, we will all see it from different perspectives. So Matthew saw it from one perspective, but Luke saw it from a different perspective and emphasized more of that story to us. So let's take it from verse 25. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood to test Jesus. He said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus replied to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" Verse 27, he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Right? In verse 28 says, "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." In other words, do this and you will have eternal life. Do this and God is pleased with you, because this is what it's all about. Love God and love your neighbor. Right? But remember, our question is, who's our neighbor? So the guy then goes on to say, in verse 29, but he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "Who then is my neighbor?" Because if I'm supposed to love my neighbor, I need to know who my neighbor is, so that I can be obedient to God. And then in reply to this question, Jesus goes on to tell a story. And listen to the story Jesus tells. From verse 30, he says, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. When he fell into the hands of robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side." This was a priest. A priest saw the guy that had been beaten up and robbed. A priest is, let's say, a pastor. Somebody that you expect to have compassion. Somebody that you expect to love people and be considerate and be warm towards them and be willing to help. A pastor walks by and just ignores him. Which is what most of them do these days anyway. Forgive me, ignore that. A pastor comes and goes by. Okay, from verse 32, so it says, "So too a Levite." Levites, if you read the Old Testament, Levites were people that God had in the temple, that were always constantly, imagine a church, people that were working in the church staff. These were people that were serving before God, praying, worshiping. They're the ones that did this. When people brought their sacrifice, their sin offering, and to get forgiveness from God, the Levites would be the ones that made the sacrifices and things of that nature. So they were also people of God. They were people that served in God's house. You can see them as leaders in the church. Let's put it that way. So a Levite was also supposed to be somebody that had a relationship, a close walk with God. So you would expect a Levite to have love and compassion towards people. But look at what the Levite does. The Levite too came, from verse 32, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by the other side. Passed by the other side. So it's even possible that he was on the side where the guy had been robbed and beaten, and then when he saw him, he decided, "I'm crossing the road because I don't have to do with you." These are people that you expect to help you, and they just walked past. But a Samaritan came. And what you have to understand about Samaritans, it emphasized a Samaritan because there was a clash between the Samaritans and the Jews. There was prejudice. There was like almost racism between them. So you wouldn't expect a Samaritan to help a Jew. I'm assuming the guy that was robbed and beaten up was probably a Jew. Otherwise, it wouldn't have emphasized the point that this next guy that came along was a Samaritan. And if you know the story about the woman at the well, you remember the story about the woman at the well? She was sitting by the well, and Jesus came along and said, "Oh, give me some water." And he was telling her about, I've got water that will give you eternal life and all that kind of stuff. And then the disciples came. If you remember that story, the disciples came. If I have time, I'll try and find it for you. And the disciples were saying, if Jesus was truly a prophet, why is he talking to a Samaritan woman? Doesn't he know that Jews and Samaritans are not supposed to mix? So from that, you can tell that there was a clash between them. There was prejudice between them. They were not people that got along. So you wouldn't expect a Samaritan to help a Jew or a Jew to help a Samaritan. And then the Samaritan comes along in this case, going back to our story, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw the man, he had pity on him. The very person that actually had the right to pass by the other side and ignore him. This was actually now the person that had pity on him. He could have looked at him and said, "Ah, you Jew, you racist, good for you. You got what you deserve." That should have been his attitude, because they don't get along normally. But he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine.